Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be continuing our series in mating patterns, and this is our second part in the series. And the first mating pattern that we are going to go over today is Damiano's mate. And as you can tell, it arises from the situation right here where you have either a pawn or a bishop on g6. It really doesn't matter, each one. And we have our queen here on the open h file. And as you can see here, we don't have a pawn here on our h file. It doesn't really matter as long as the h file is open or semi-open, that we can have access to the king here. And it's white's move, and white can bring his queen to h7 and checkmate the king. The king is blocked off from f8. There is a piece on f8, and he can't come to this f7 square because our pawn or bishop is in the way. So this is Damiano's mate. Now let's take a look at an example and see how we can apply that to an actual game. And here's our example, and it's white's move, and as you can see, I've replaced the pawn with a bishop here just to show you it really doesn't matter which one we use, and I did want to go over just the concept. So take a minute if you want to do it on your own and think about white's best move in this case. And remember, think about Damiano's mate that we're trying to look for, and remember, no matter what you can do, sacrifice whatever pieces you have to make sure you can get that particular situation in a game, because it's checkmate, and that's what we're going for. So take a minute. Hopefully you came up with the move rook to h8, and it's a sacrifice move. Black's only move is to capture this rook. He can't come to f7 or h7 because of the bishop, and he can't come to h7 because of our rook as well. He has to take on h8. We can now bring our rook to h1, check again. He has to move back. We can now sacrifice another rook on h8. Again, he has to take on h8. We can now bring our queen to h1. He is forced to retreat once again to g8. And here we have Damiano's mate. We can bring our queen to h7 and checkmate. So as you can see in this situation, we actually sacrificed two rooks. But in the very end, since we know what Damiano's mate is, we had a pretty easy win, mate in 5. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next example mating pattern. The next mating pattern is Morphy's mate, named after one of the greatest chess minds of all time. And it looks like this. As you can see, we have a bishop on f6 attacking the king, and the g file is open for our rook. So the king is checkmated, he can't go anywhere. So we are using our bishop and our rook in this situation. Obviously a queen would work here, but for simplistic reasons, bishop and rook is all you need in this case. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example how we can use this in a normal game. In this example, if you look at it, most people would actually think that black has a better position. His king looks very well protected, and if you can see, he's up in material. But since we know Morphy's mate, we can use the rules that we've looked at to approach a game where we know the ending is going to be good for us. So take a minute and think about where you think white should go so that we can approach Morphy's mate. And hopefully you came up with the move queen captures f6. Now from here we are threatening queen takes on g7 checkmate. So they're going to have to defend that. Once they take on f6, now where do we go? We bring our rook to g1 check, and when the king moves, we can now come in with our bishop, capture on f6, and checkmate. So from here, it looked like a pretty even situation. It even looked like black was ahead, but we were able to have a queen sacrifice because we knew Morphy's mate, and we have a pretty easy win. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next example. This is kind of like Morphy's mate, and it's Morphy's concealed mate. Morphy's concealed mate is very similar to Morphy's mate, but there's one additional step that you have to take, and we're going to go over that now. So pause the video and see if you can try to figure out how to mate, in this case, as white. The first move is going to, hopefully you figured out, the first move is rook captures on g7. The black king is forced to move to h8, and now the key move right here. A lot of players will want to move their rook back to g1. This is actually going to be a huge mistake. Black can move his pawn to f6, blocking our bishop, and black's actually has a better game here. He has more material, and we no longer have the Morphy mate threat that we had before. So instead, we need to play a different move instead of rook to g1. And instead of rook g1, we know that when we move our rook, it's going to be a discovered attack from our bishop on b2. So we want to remove this defender on f7 and capture him on f7. We're checking with our bishop, but now that pawn is not going to bring us any more trouble. So now when the king moves back to g8, we can now check on g7. The king is forced to move to h8. We can now come back to g1. Now when the king moves, now the rook is going to have to come to f6 to block. And now we can capture on f6 with our bishop, and it's checkmate. So there's one extra move with Morphy's concealmate that you have to know to make sure that you don't make a huge blunder and bring your rook back to g1, and instead you take the defender from f7. So those are both Morphy's mate and Morphy's concealed mate. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next mating pattern. The next mating pattern is called Ready's mate, and it looks like this. Your bishop is on d8, the king cannot move to b6, and he can't move to the d file because of our rook, and our bishop is protected by our rook on d1. And it comes about, we heard about this from one of the most famous games that a lot of you have probably already seen, and it comes about from the situation like this. So take a minute. If you haven't already seen this puzzle, it would definitely be a good puzzle to try on your own, but see if you can reach this position on your own. And hopefully you came up with a brilliant sacrifice, and that is queen to d8. And as you can see here, the king has to capture. He can't move to e7 or d7. He has to capture the queen. From here, white has a fantastic move of bishop to g5 double check. And anytime a king is in double check, he has to move his king. He cannot move any other piece. So the black king is forced to move. If he moves to e8, we can bring our rook to d8 and it'll be checkmate. It doesn't matter. In this case, we'll go ahead and put the black king on c7 just so we can have the same setup as Ready's mate. That's what happened in the real game. And we can bring our bishop to d8 and it's checkmate. But again, even if the black king moves to e8, we can bring our rook to d8 and it's checkmate. Either way, but as long as you know the situation and how it'll rise. And it normally happens when the king is not castled for black or white, depending on which way it's set up. And white is castled on the queen side, so his rook is lined up on the d file. So that is Ready's mate, and the next one we're going to look at is Smothered mate. It's one that you'll see very, very often, and it's the last mate that we're going to look at. So we'll go ahead and take a look at Smothered mate. Smothered mate looks like this. The king is trapped in and is checked by the knight here on f7 and can't move. He's what they call smothered. And this is going to be the most common besides the back rank mate that you're going to find. And a lot of players miss so many opportunities for smothered mates because they just don't know what to look for. And so we're going to take a look at an example. There's a lot of different examples out there, but we're going to go ahead and take one look at it and see something that you should be looking for when it comes to smothered mate. So the example we're going to look at is here, and as you can see, white is down a whole lot of material, but we have a knight near the black king, and the black king is near the corner, and we have a very active piece, our white queen on the e-file, that can jump into the action very quickly. When you see this, you should be looking for smothered mate. So, take a minute, see if you can figure this out on your own. And hopefully you came up with the move queen to e6 check. Now black has two options here. His first move is to move into checkmate immediately with king to f8, and then we can checkmate with f7. That's usually not going to happen. Instead, you'll normally see the black king come to h8. Now here's where it gets interesting. We can bring our knight to f7, check. The only move black has is to move back to g8. And here's the tricky move right here. It's knight to h6. It's a discovered check with our queen. and we're putting our knight where we want him to go. So, like we said before, the king has to move. He's not going to move to f8 because he'd be moving into checkmate, so he's going to move back to h8. And then here, we can bring our queen to g8 check. The black king cannot capture because of our knight. The only move he has is to capture with his rook on g8. And from here, the final blow, knight to f7, checkmate. So, you will see smothered mate in various traps in the beginning. You will see smothered mates at the end of games, but always be looking for, especially when a knight is around a king. You don't necessarily need a queen involved, but many times you can have a nice little queen sacrifice with a knight.